This is Senior Algebra, section 6.5, solving quadratic equations here. So today we're extending 6.5 a little bit and doing some more of irregular quadratics that we're looking at here. So in example 1, first thing I look at is I see two things on each side here. So I have x and 20 and x squared, so I have to get everything over to one side. Now I have an option here. For me, I like always having the x squared term as positive, so I'm going to move everything over to the left-hand side. So I'm going to write this as x squared minus x minus 20. So again, I just move the x and the 20 over to the other side. And now I have equal to 0. So at this point, I'm going to factor. When I factor the left side, I get x minus 5, x plus 4. And at this point, I have two things that are multiplied to each other to equal 0. So what do we know? When we have two things that are multiplied to be 0, one of them has to be 0. So I set x minus 5 equal to 0, or x minus 4 has to equal 0. When I solve it, I get x equals 5, x equals 4 here. So notice in a quadratic, I'm usually going to get two solutions here. In this case, 5 and 4 here. So again, get everything over to one side first here. Get one side equal to 0, everything over to the other side. Now, how else could I have done it? Well, I could have moved the x squared over to the other side here. Give me a little bit more room here. And if I wanted to deal with a positive x squared, I could have multiplied by a negative 1 to each side. Again, I get 0 because that's that. But then I get x squared minus x minus 20 on the other side here. So I could have done that as well. Multiplied by a negative 1. Could you have not multiplied by a negative 1 and just factored it? That would be fine too. Doesn't matter. So in B, I have x squared minus 4x equals 0 here. So I have an x in every term. So I'm going to pull an x out here. Now at this point, I have x times x minus 4. So in this case, I really do have two things that are multiplied to be 0. Now, you could think of it as x minus 0 or x plus 0, and then x minus 4 if you wanted to. But I'm going to have two things here, multiplied to be 0. So the first one, well, x equals 0. And then the second one, x minus 4 equals 0. I'm going to move the 4 over to the other side here. So I get x equals 4, x equals 0 here. So in example 2, in this one I take a look and I have an x squared minus. So first thing I would think of is, can I think about this like a difference of two squares here? So I'm going to factor this, 4x minus 5, 4x plus 5 equals 0. At this point I have two things multiplied together to be 0, so I set each of them equal to 0. 4x minus 5 equals 0, and 4x plus 5 equals 0. So I'm going to solve each of them, move the 5 over, divide by 4, so I get 4x equals 5, so x is 5 halves, or 5 fourths, sorry, and here I get x is negative 5 fourths. Now another way to kind of think about this is, since there is only an x squared in it, I could have just gotten x alone here. So if I look at that one here, you know, if I thought about it that way, oh, well, I could have done it a little bit differently. Now, it did ask me to solve by factoring, so this is the correct way to do it, what we just did. So, but you could have thought of it as, oh, move the 25 over, divide by 16, you get x squared is 25 over 16. Now, how do I get rid of something that is squared? I take the square root. So, and whenever I take the square root, I do have to have a plus or minus in there. So, x is going to equal the square root of 25, which is 5, and the square root of 16, which is 4. So I have 5/4 and negative 5/4, plus and minus here. So another way to kind of think about that one. In B, so I have x cubed and an x here. So the first thing I would look to do is take out an x. I'm also going to take out the 6 as well. And I'm left with this, x squared minus 1. In this one, I still am going to factor. So I have x squared minus 1. I'm still going to factor that. That's a difference of 2 squares. So I'm going to have 6x, and then I'm going to factor x squared minus 1 into x plus 1 and x minus 1. At this point, I have 3 things multiplied to be 0. So I do it the same way I did before. The first thing, 6x equals 0. The second thing, x minus 1 equals 0. The third term, x plus 1 equals 0. So I solve each of them for 0. Divide by 6, I get x is 0. Move the 1 over, I get x is 1. Move the 1 over, I get x is negative 1. So I have 3 answers. Notice x cubed, I'm going to have a maximum of 3 answers there. Then the last one here, C. Probably the most difficult one because it requires the most steps. So in this one, I'm going to blow it up and then put it back together here. So I'm going to distribute, I'm going to FOIL these, x plus 1, x plus 1. I get x squared plus 1x plus 1x plus 1, so x squared plus 2x. So basically, I have to get a 0 on one side. So I'm going to blow things up, move everything over to one side, so I get something equals 0. Now, how do you want to do this? Well, I can move the x's over, minus x, minus x. I can do the same thing with the 3x, minus 3x and minus 3x squared. So I get a 0 on that side. I can put the 1 and the 5 together and get 6 here. So I have negative 2x squared plus x plus 6. At this point, for me, I don't like working with the negative for my x squared here. So I'm going to multiply by a negative 1. Again, you don't have to. You could definitely leave it in there and just factor by grouping that way, but I tend to like it better. So I have 2x squared minus x minus 6. And now I'm going to factor. I could do factor by grouping. I could do guess and check here. Either one is fine. If I did guess and check, I know it's going to be a 2x and an x. And now what multiplies a 6? Well, I know 6 and 1 does. 2 and 3 does. So I check. I go, okay, 3x, negative 2x, and 2x is negative 4x. Yeah, that'll work. So I check my inside terms, my outside terms, and my last term here. So now I have 2 things multiplied to be 0, so I set each of them equal to 0. So I know that 2x plus 3 equals 0. And x minus 2 equals 0. So I solve each of these. On the right side, on the right one, I'm going to get x equals 2. On the left one, I get x equals negative 3/2. So I get my 2 possible answers here. X is 2, x is negative 3/2.